We know Hemingway the author, but what about Hemingway the man? Next on Global Perspectives, we'll hear stories from someone who really knows.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Cuba has been a mystery to most Americans since the fall of Batista. The U.S. and USSR faced off over missiles in Cuba in the 1960s, and the country has been closed to us since then. Now, as tourists from other countries visit to enjoy the weather, most Americans view Cuba as something of a time capsule, right down to its revolutionary leader. Today, we are talking to a woman who can take us back to those early days, Valerie Hemingway, secretary to the great author and later his daughter-in-law, was a first-hand witness to a lot of history. Welcome to the show, Valerie.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
I don't have the opportunity to ask this question very often, but what was it like when you first met Ernest Hemingway?
The moment probably escaped me at the time because I wasn't aware of his fame, and that I had come from Ireland and was doing a regular interview. For me, it was just a job. I had read one or two of his books and liked them, but they weren't my favorite by any means. So when I met him, it wasn't a momentous occasion, but it turned out to be because of the consequences.
And what was it that helped propel you in that direction? Was it the man himself? Was it his writing? Was it his lifestyle? Was it the whole experience of being with him?
I think it was the whole experience. It was a combination of my history. I had grown up, my parents had separated, so I had this strange upbringing of going to a boarding school and in the summers being at a little hotel. The hotel was a funny little country place where it was as an escape for a lot of famous people. And of course, we didn't know what fame was in those days. We didn't have television. Radio was just coming in. And so when I met Hemingway, it was just like meeting one of the people from my childhood. And so I was totally at ease with him. And I think he was bemused by the fact that I didn't adore his work, you know, that it wasn't a big thing for me to meet him. And he would, we talked about literature, and then he would bring me one of his books at a time. I remember the first one was A Farewell to Arms, and he'd say, you know, read this, I think you'll really like it. And it was only later that I sort of was amazed when I looked back on it. Here is this writer he was 59, about to turn 60. I was 18, turning 19. And he's asking my opinion of his writing.
He wanted to know your opinion, and you've said before Hemingway was very interested in meeting new people and finding out all about him, which is very different from the perception that some people have of him as being more inward-looking, more egotistical in some respects.
He was outgoing in a reserved sort of way. When he liked you, then he opened up completely to you. And he was quite shy in public situations and awkward. He hated to wear a jacket and tie. He always felt uncomfortable dressed up and having to behave in a certain way. He just liked to be himself and to be like the sportsman and the writer without restrictions on the formalities of life. And so he built up a little, what he called his quadrilla, his little followers around him, people who were a buffer between him and the outside world. And I was very lucky to become part of that quadrilla. It was like a movable feast. It was a movable group because people came and they went. People came to visit, and he accumulated people. Some people, I'm thinking now particularly in Spain, where he wasn't at his own home. He was staying at the home of friends. Mary, his wife, was quite upset about this because they always had stayed in hotels, and therefore they had their privacy. It's a little different when you're in someone else's house. but the hosts really did take into consideration that Hemingways wanted a certain amount of privacy, but on the other hand, they wanted company. So they selected all sorts of people like Ken Tynan, the British drama critic, and his wife of that time, her name was Bundy, Elaine Bundy, and there were people like Robert Trout, who was a CBS presenter. You know, there was just a diverse Eric Severoid. People came and went, but there were his core friends that he knew he could rely on. General Buck Lanham, for instance, he could rely on for good company, good stories, and adventure. And then he gathered people in, mostly young people that he met, people who might just have come up for an autograph and made some comment on his work or how he had influenced them, and he'd say, sit and have a drink, and if they liked, he'd say, if he liked them, he'd say, well, stay on till dinner, and then a week later you'd find them still at the end of the table. I mean, he opened up my mind to do things, just to sit there or even just read about it. So, you know, he said, well, you must go to Pamplona. You can't spend a year in Spain and not have that experience. And not only did I manage to have that experience, but I went up there as his guest and spent the entire week, went to the bullfights every day. In the mornings, we'd go picnicking by the Orati River, a little bit of fishing, a little bit of everything of life, eating. I mean, in Ireland, you know, it was boiled food, boiled meat, boiled vegetables. You know, I mean, it was just something you got over with. You washed it down with Guinness or a glass of whiskey, and you went on to the next thing. And with him, eating was it was an art, and it was a pleasure.
Tell us about your book is called Running with the Bulls, and you know, the experience of that every year in Pamplona and the bullfights. How does all of that fit into your evolving perspective of Hemingway at this point?
It was funny. I thought, you know, when I met Hemingway, I thought this is a half-hour deal and I'm going to write about it, and that's the end of that, as it had been with several other interviews. But it turns out, like, to this day, I'm still sort of connected to the Hemingway family. So there's hardly been a year that I wasn't in some way, because for 4 years I worked on the papers, and then the year after that I married Greg Hemingway, and life went on in its own haphazard way. To this day, every year there are new books about Hemingway and new articles and studies and so on. And people started, when they ran out of everybody else to talk to, they started coming to me and saying, can you tell me about this? And when Hemingway asked me to be his secretary, there was only one condition, and that was, if you live with me and you know, live in my household with family and work, you do not write about it. He said, you will, always was very practical, and he said to me, you will learn enough that you will be able to write about many things from being with and around me, but I don't want you to write about me and my family. That's off bounds. Now, there was no written contract, but in the early years when I was being besieged, I worked in publishing in New York City, and I had many opportunities to write about Hemingway and talk about Hemingway. And I absolutely felt it was off bounds. He felt his life, he wanted his life to be kept private. But when I came to do my biography, at first I did not want to write. And then I realized as time went by and Mary died and Greg died, and you know, Ernest was long dead, and people build up things. So they began to, you know, depended on who was writing, but they wanted to put in little things, and there would be fanciful things that he and I maybe had an affair or something. It was really, I was really like part of the family. That was, and a very close friend and almost a daughter. So.
And in that capacity, yeah, there had to be complete trust. Were there secrets that you had with him that nobody else knew of?
Well, there were. I mean, particularly about the suicide, Mary never understood about it. It was a complete, well, I don't know whether you know, when you look back on things, whether it was a complete shock, but she never imagined he would commit suicide and couldn't understand why. And she really went to once she realized he was so depressed, she went to every length to do whatever could be done to avert the suicide. And we talked over and over after he died. You know, she would say, Val, how was it we missed the signs? How did we not know? And, you know, I couldn't tell her, you know, he had told me, and he'd been very open with me about, this is what I'm going to do. I don't see any future. There's nothing further for me. And because basically his life was his writing, and he was smart enough and wise enough to know that his writing wasn't better. I mean, as far as what he wanted in his life was that he would always write better than he had written before, and he would write something new. And it wasn't just to write. I mean, he always wrote. That was part of his nature. But when he realized that he wasn't going to write another great masterpiece, and when he was depressed, the two things together meant life isn't worth living. You know, what is there to live for? Mary, of course, I mean, didn't see that because she was in a completely different place with him, you know, and she really did go out of her way to try and make things work. But I avoided, you see, I felt if I'm going to write, or even if I'm going to be part of an interview, be part of someone else's book, you have to tell the truth. There's no value. I mean, if you're talking nonfiction, I mean, in some ways, somehow we've lost that sort of ethic of truthfulness. We now tend to play to what people want to hear, you know. But I was brought up with a code of absolute truth. As the school I went to, our motto was Veritas, truth. And it was a bit like that with Hemingway. There was something very puritanical about him.
Tell us about your arrival in Cuba.
I can remember that, first getting off the little plane and that breath of warm air. And you know, when you live in Ireland, where you get this blast of cold, icy air, I mean, even in the summer, it's chilly. And so, I mean, I thought that was wonderful. And the other thing was that there was always music in the air. In Cuba, there was, in those days, it was the beginning of the transistor radio. So everyone had a little radio, and windows, if they had windows, were open. And there was this sort of music, this Caribbean music, thump, thump, thump. And it was rather wonderful, and big splashy flowers, you know, hibiscus and things, and the palm trees. I mean, I just felt it was a paradise when I went there. And then Ernest was there at the airport to meet me, and we went back to the house, and all the staff were on the steps, and you know, it was it was like one of the royal family. You're up on I don't know if you know the house, but it has these great big steps, and in those days there was an old ceiba tree. The roots went under the floor in the living room. And Ernest loved it because he never wore shoes in the house, and he could feel that the tiles, you know, were all sort of wiggledy and up, and you could feel the roots of the tree as you walked, and he just loved that about his house. He wouldn't let anyone rearrange the tiles and so on. And now the tree has been cut down. That was entirely what I felt there: warmth, music. And people smiled, happy people.
At the same time, Cuba was going through a period of tremendous political change.
So it took a little while for me when I settled in. It took a little while for me then to find that that things were not exactly as they appeared on the surface. But I just remember Castro getting on the radio, and he would talk for hours and hours, and you know, telling the people, he would talk 4 or 5 hours at a time, and everyone would be rather glued. In those days, Castro was a hero. I mean, he was the savior. Life was going to be so much better. Everybody was happy about it. Now, Hemingway was pleased, but he absolutely made a division between, you know, his life and politics. He did not, he had a tremendous interest in politics and world affairs and wanted to know what was going on, was terribly curious and knew how to get to the top people. But Hemingway, he kept out of, he did not, he felt if he got into politics, or if he were to take sides or make generalizations or specifics, that would change his position. As a writer of fiction, he had to always see things from all sides. He could not be partisan. I mean, that's something I wish people could learn today. That's just an aside. Because Hemingway saw that it is one, you know, what we live in one global entity, and that, you know, there's always a counterbalance to everything. Every action has a reaction. And so, although he clearly admired Castro, in that petition, he'd just come in, the people loved him, and there was hope for the future. It was a great sorrow to him when he learned that the U.S. government had difficulties and differences with Castro, and that he was literally going to have to leave the country because America was going to sever diplomatic ties, and Americans were not to stay there. And you know, he argued, you know, I'm a writer. I've nothing to do with politics. I've seen revolutions come and go, and it has made no difference. This is my home. This is where I write most. He always saw himself as an American writer, but he felt that he had to be outside of a place to write about it. Like when he wrote his wonderful stories on Michigan, he was living in Paris. And, you know, he was often in another place. He removed himself from where he was going to write about, because he was not, I guess maybe the place in some ways contaminates, especially when you're fictionalizing, you're writing about a certain time, and things change. They change all the time, and you want to remember exactly how it was.
He didn't live long after the revolution. What happened to everything that he had there? His writings, his books, his personal effects?
They knew that they would never be able to go back, but still you thought, well, things will change. And so that he'd left everything there. I mean, and he was still paying his staff, and they were, you know, they were dependent on the livelihood. I mean, some of them had been there since 1940. You know, that was 21 years they'd worked for him. And so things were not tied up at all. And so Mary asked me if I'd go down with her, because I had an Irish passport. Well, I hadn't become an American. I hadn't even thought I'd ever be living in America. I just thought this is just another little episode in my life. And I spoke Spanish, and I'd been at the finca with them when they left, and I'd been working with her, and so she knew that I knew where things were. We went down together. Castro left a note, a big bowl of fruit when we arrived. He had gone up the day before we arrived, and he left a note and said, if you need anything, just call on me. And he did come and have dinner with us one evening. And Mary was a tough old bird. In fact, sometimes when she wrote to me, she'd say, you know, love from your old bird. He often referred to herself as an old bird. But she was a tough old bird, you see. So she said to Castro that she wanted to take well, manuscripts and papers, and the paintings, and, you know, some silver, things that were important, both her own personal things and Ernest's. Well, now, at the time, by that time, everything had been nationalized in Cuba. So, I mean, the law of the land was you couldn't remove anything because it automatically belonged to the government. And the second thing was that there was no way there was no communication by that time in July of 1961 between the United States and Cuba. There was one plane that went every day, Pan Am plane, and it was filled up, and you couldn't bring, I mean, hand luggage was the very least, most you could bring. I mean, just what you had in your hand, because they packed it with people. And so you were told no, nothing but your purse or your minor. I mean, not even like the hand luggage we have today. And so we had to figure out a way to get things out. But Castro looked at Mary, and I must say, he was 33 at the time. When I think of it now, how young he was. And he had that smile. He just sort of smiled, and he said, we'll have to break a few rules, you know. And basically what he said to her was, as far as, you know, you do what you need to do, and we won't stop you. We sat on the quay, the wharf there at Havana, the harbor, and we watched all these boats coming in, thinking like maybe one of them would take this just across in 90 miles to Key West, you know. One day there was this boat that had an American flag, and it pulled in. And Mary was there. She was puffing on her Camel cigarette. She always had a carton of Camel cigarettes. She had a deep voice. And I was sitting there sort of watching the passers-by. And I mean, after a while, I wasn't even so aware. And she was the one who saw the American flag and said, Val, you know, so she went down to meet the boat coming in. It was a fishing, just an old fishing boat coming in from, I think it was Argentina. It had shrimp and lobster tails, and it was coming in. It was going into Tampa. So she said, "Could she speak to the captain?" He came off, and he told her that the refrigeration had broken down. They had this cargo, but it wouldn't last to the States, and either they had two choices: to dump it in the sea, or to take it in. Now, already in Havana, food was getting scarce. And so he thought maybe he could get some money for this, but he didn't want to break any American rules, but he thought maybe he could do something. And so Mary said, could you take some household, crates of household goods back to Tampa? And he said, no. He said, I can't. He said, the paperwork, he said, I don't want to get involved in anything. And so then Mary sort of indicated to me to step back, and I saw her poking in her purse for her wallet, and they went on board, and she came back like 10 minutes later with a big grin on her face. So she greased his palm, and he agreed. He had no idea who it was or what she had. We brought down the stuff to the put it on the boat, saw the boat go off. We were just jumping with joy, and then drove back. It's about 15, 20 minutes to the house. And on the way back, we both looked at each other and said, wait a minute. You know, that was an old manuscript of The Old Man, the Sea, Dangerous Summer, many short stories, unpublished manuscripts, Islands in the Stream, Garden of Eden. I mean, untold wealth. I mean, no copies of this. I mean, these were not the days of Xeroxes, and letters, photographs. I mean, irreplaceable stuff. And then $2 million worth of paintings. A wonderful collection of paintings that are now in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And, you know, we looked at each other and we thought, no insurance, we don't know these people, are they, you know, nothing. There was, so we had 2 or 3 weeks of absolute, you know, no way of getting in touch with them, no, you know. We got to Tampa about 3 weeks later, and actually everything was there. But it was like our hearts were in our mouth, because supposing it was all gone, it could have been. I mean, they could have had another disaster. You know, it was a story that ended well.
Well, thank you, Valerie Hemingway, for joining us today.
Oh, you're so welcome.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.